Okay, today we're going to be doing a simple pad replacement on the back of this Honda Accord. It's a very common rear brake, disc brake setup. If it's got a spring and a lever on the back here for the park brake on the back of the caliper, you need to be careful. These are very expensive calipers, and it's easy to ruin them. If you've got a park brake lever back underneath here, that means the shoes are inside here, and it's just like doing the front. You take the caliper off, push the piston back, and put your pads in. So what we're going to do, first thing you have to do is make sure that the park brake is actually released, rotor should turn, and that the lever here actually moves, because if you can't push that lever like that, that means that's seized up in here, and you need to replace the caliper. It's not practical to try and repair that. So the first thing you have to do is take these two bolts out. They hold the caliper onto the bracket on the back. Obviously you want to make sure that there's no leaks, fluid leaks around here. That would be another reason to replace the caliper. Make sure that the brake hose isn't cracked or have bubbles on it. That would be a reason to replace the brake hose. If your brake pads have worn down to the metal and they've scored the rotor, you're going to have to replace or have the rotors remachined. Now when you get these bolts out of here, to pull the caliper back from the brake rotor and the pads, it's a little touch and go as to whether or not you got enough slack on the park brake cables there. But in most cases you can do it. It just takes a little bit of wiggling. So I pull up on one side, wiggle here, there we go, and it's off. So all you do is get the pads out of here. Now there's a problem right there. That pad is seized tight in there. That causes the pad to wear quicker. In this case, actually, it hasn't created any damage. So make sure that the rotor is smooth. Make sure that these areas where the pads slide in are cleaned. So I just take a sharpened or sharp-edged screwdriver and just make sure you get all the rust and the dirt accumulated off of there. You want to make sure that your new brake pads can actually slide easily and don't jam in there. If you buy pads that have got a new hardware in it for this, and just pry these off and make sure that the underside is clean, there's no rust buildup, and then just put in the new plates. So once you got that clean, next thing you have to do is you got to push this piston back. And if you see inside the piston here, if I can move I'll move the camera here. Now any brake caliper that's got the park brake mechanism as part of the caliper will have a piston that has a slot or a cross like this, and what that does is on the back of the brake pads, I'll show you, this is the pad that goes in the back side. It's got a little bump in there, or some pads have got two, and that engages in the slot here, and that will prevent the piston from rotating, because as the piston comes out and as you operate the park brake, the mechanism inside wants to rotate that as it unscrews to adjust for the pad wear. And if this was to rotate, like if you put a brake pad here that didn't have the pin in the back, that would rotate and your park brake wouldn't adjust. So we have to retract this. What you do not want to do is try to force this piston back. If you try to just push it back in, this goes for any car that's got a caliper mechanism or park brake mechanism in the caliper. If you try to force that back, you're going to break the mechanism and ruin the caliper. So what you need to have is a little tool like this, and they come in various types for various cars. It's just a this one's just kind of like a magic cube here. It's got different size pins for different size calipers, and you can just you can buy one of these. These work for imports with small calipers, and then there's a larger round one that works well for domestics. So find one that fits well, and what you have to do is basically you just screw it in. You have to support the back of the caliper here, put it up against the suspension, engage these pins into the slot, lean into it real hard, and just slowly wind it in. And when it goes in and is seated all the way, you want to make sure that the slots are vertical like this, because if they're not lined up with the pad on the back and you force it in, you're either going to jam the brakes and burn up the brakes, or it's going to damage the mechanism for the park brake when you put pressure on it. Okay, so I'm going to have to move the camera here so I can work on this. Now these can be either very easy to turn or very hard to turn. I did the other side already and it wasn't too bad. We'll see if this side works. There it goes. Now technically you could do this with a couple of big screwdrivers, cross them and get in here, but I'll tell you, this is a whole lot easier than trying to use screwdrivers. And it's going in. It's just a little awkward for me to do this here. Now I'll give you a tip what you can do if you can't really hang on to the caliper very well, or it takes a lot of pressure leaning into it, or you need two hands to turn this, whatever. What you do is you take your bracket off here, and you take your rotor off, and then you put the bracket back on, and then you put the caliper into the mount. There we go. Now it turns easy. And I'm just going to make sure I get that groove lined up properly. You can eyeball it. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. You'll tell when you put the caliper on. That looks pretty good. Anyways, you mount the bracket on here without the rotor, and you mount the caliper to the bracket, and you can just go finger tight. And then you can lean with both hands on the tool here and wind that in. If it doesn't want to turn or it doesn't go in, it's likely a problem with the caliper. You may have to replace it. Some cars, especially models of Volkswagen, their pistons take a lot of pressure going in. As long as you can rotate the piston, it's good to put pressure on it. But you may have to lean or have somebody lean on your back to push it in, because sometimes those suckers are really tight to go in. But as long as they're turning, just keep pressing on it. So we've got the piston in position here. I don't know if you can see it on the camera. And we just slip the pads in now. Now here's an area where I've seen people make mistakes. If you buy a set of brake pads, don't be at all surprised if they go in tight, or they won't even go in. Like this is too tight. If it takes that much pressure, you're going to have problems. Don't be afraid to take a coarse file and file the tabs here that go inside the guides here. It does not make sense to take new brake pads and force them in so that they're so tight you can't move them, because they have to retract with virtually no effort, because anything that on any of these springs that push the pads back are not going to be strong enough to move a brake pad that you had to lean on or hammer in to get in. I see on forums all the time. There we go. See, this is, you don't want them loose that they clunk and rattle. Don't take them to a grinder. But basically a coarse file, and you just take off the edge. These things are stamped out, and the machines often leave a sharp burr here, which catches. As I was saying, often I'll see on a forum, someone's put brake pads in, and they say, my brakes are smoking, they're hot, they're seized up. And people say, well, how did you put the brake pads in? Well, I had to use a hammer because they were tight. Well, just because you bought them and they're new doesn't mean they're going to just fit the way that they're supposed to fit, believe it or not. There we go. So now you take some either high temp brake grease. I use Never Cease here because it's meant for hot stuff, and I have it in the shop. So just put it on the two surfaces here, that contact. Slip your pad in. Same thing here. Make sure that when you're handling brake friction materials like brake shoes or brake pads, don't have mucky, greasy, gooey hands and you're putting your paws all over the friction surface or all over the brake rotor. It's only going to cause problems. Okay, so the pads are in and they move easy. Okay, now we just got to put this back on. Now with the groove lined up here, it'll slide right over top the pin that's on the back of the brake pad here. And also you want to make sure that these things turn really easy with your fingers. They should move and they should turn, because as the brake pad wears, the caliper has to follow it in, whereas this pad wears, it has to move that way. If these things don't move like really easy, you got to take the boot back. I'll just take one out. Take the boot back and clean it up. Take some emery paper, polish it up there. Get it really clean, get some brake grease on here, or silicone grease works excellent in here. You can use silicone grease. Don't use regular grease or you'll ruin the rubber boots here. And clean that out because they have to go. You can buy new pins at the dealer or the auto supply. So I'm just going to slide this caliper back on. Again, you may have to pull a little bit to get it to clear the pads and stretch the cable. There we go. Okay. Then we just put the bolts back in. After you get the caliper tight, spin the brake rotor and make sure it actually spins. It should easily, otherwise you shouldn't have been able to get the caliper on as easy as I did. Now it's normal to hear a bit of scraping noise. When you got brand new brake pads in here, they haven't worn into where the rust is on the edge of the rotors and stuff, so when you spin them, you'll hear a bit of a scraping noise. This isn't so bad at all. Now that you got that tight, put your wheel on, tighten your wheel, and all you have to do before you move the car is pump the brake several times to move the piston out and take up all the clearance in here between the pad and the rotor. Generally, I don't pump the pedal more than halfway because the pedal doesn't normally move more than halfway under normal operation. And it's possible on an older vehicle or with a worn master cylinder, if you hit it right to the floor and pump it furiously, you're going to damage the cups on the inside of the master cylinder because they don't normally travel that far. And it's possible there could be a lip that's worn in the bore, and you do that and you'll lose all pressure to your brake system. So about half pedal, pump it several times until you feel it firm up, and that's all you have to do. Your park brake will automatically adjust as the piston comes out. It might get a little bit snugger after your brakes are worn in. So that's it. Put your wheel on, enjoy your brakes.